Each week I've been meeting with you, introducing you to some new aspect of our journey toward spiritual maturity. In doing so, we've been following the footsteps of Moses and his band of Israelites as they made their way across the Sinai towards the Promised Land. In one of my journeys, not too long ago, as I walked through the Sinai, I took a group of men with me. We stopped at various places so I could teach. Week by week, I was sharing with them as I have been sharing with you. This time as an introduction to your Bible study. In the first stop, you remember, which I called a potty stop at the waters of Marah, I talked about purging. Then we moved to Elim, the place of provision. Next, I climbed up on a rock, and you listened as I talked about Moses striking to bring forth water. That was a lesson in obedience. Then we journeyed to Rephidim, where Moses held up his hands over the valley. That was a lesson on authority. I talked to you about the rod of Moses, and about God's manna, and about the graves of craving. Now, today, I want to talk to you about God's call. I want to flash back to the time when Moses first heard the call of God at the burning bush. That was near the base of Mount Sinai. For if we're to move towards spiritual maturity, we must be certain of God's call on our life. Why not find a seat in the sand? Listen in as I share with my friends, talking about what happened at that burning bush when God called Moses.
You know, there's certain days in the lives of people that arrive unannounced, that don't have any heralded trumpets of any kind, no lightning flashes. They seem to be common, ordinary days. And yet, looking back on them, we find out that they're the most important and special days in our lives. Moses had one of these days. He'd been out here in this wilderness for 40 years, had given up all thoughts of ever going back to Egypt, of ever having his place in the Pharaoh's palace again, was doing simply the thing that his hand found to do. He was herding sheep and goats for his father-in-law Jethro, doing the common things. When coming through a valley very similar to this, came to the base of Mount Sinai. And it was a morning very much like this morning, with the sun coming up over the mountains, the sheep and goats foraging on the hillside, Moses leaning back up against his staff and resting, when he noticed a phenomena that has changed history. A bush, perhaps a bush like this broom bush, caught on fire. That's not an unusual thing, especially at Sinai, because oftentimes the dry bushes, catching the reflecting rays of the crystals in the bottom of the wadi, do burn. But this was an unusual bush because it was not consumed when it burned. And it burned and it burned. And Moses had time. He never had time in Egypt. But out here in the desert, you have lots of time. And so Moses had time to turn aside and look at the bush. And when he got to the base of it, a voice spoke. It was the first time anyone had heard God's voice in 480 years. But God spoke and called Moses by name. You remember the little quadrant from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, earth's crammed with heaven and every common bush afire with God. But only he who hears takes off his shoes. The rest sit around and eat blackberries. You know, the problem with most of us is we're too busy. We're too busy to stop and inquire. We're too busy to get quiet and listen. And even if God called our name, we wouldn't be able to hear it because we're on the go too much. Think about all those men in the Bible that God called, Gideon and Amos and Isaiah. They were all busy men, and yet they were busy doing the things that they were supposed to be doing. Every one of them occupied with the small task that was at hand. And yet when the call of God came, they answered. Moses was 80 years old when he was out here in this desert. For 40 years he had been here. He was a middle-aged man when he arrived. And yet still God called him at the age of 80, a voice speaking out of this burning bush, giving him a task to go back to Egypt and to say to the Pharaoh, "Let my people go." There's an eternal formula that I have learned to apply to my own life, that once I submitted my life to Jesus Christ, from that time on, I had voluntarily surrendered the right to choose or the power to vary the consequences of that decision. Moses had done that with his life. He had given it over to God and was then waiting on the Lord. The word wait actually means to be entwined. It's like pieces of a rope that are all entwined together. And Moses and God had become one, even though he didn't know his name. Perhaps the greatest blessing is to be unencumbered, so that when your bush burns and when God speaks, you can rise and you can answer. We're to be busy waiting on God, because bushes still burn, and God is still calling each one of us by name, no matter how old we may be or what our circumstances are.